Welcome back, students. Today we are discussing one of the most audacious, aggressively bureaucratic, and surprisingly brilliant schemes ever cooked up in the halls of Brussels. For years, the European Union has been trying to save the planet by making pollution incredibly expensive. They want industry to go green, and they use the oldest trick in the book to do it: money. Inside the EU, there is a system called the emissions trading system. If you own a factory and you pump carbon dioxide into the air, you have to buy a permit for every ton of pollution you create. This means manufacturing things like steel, cement, or fertilizer inside Europe is expensive. Industrialists suddenly had to pay for the privilege of ruining the atmosphere, which really cuts into their profit margins. But businesses are clever, and water always finds the path of least resistance. Instead of spending millions to upgrade their factories with green technology, many companies realized they could just pack up and leave. If a company moves its steel mill to a country just outside the European Union's borders, a country that does not care about climate change, they do not have to pay a single cent for their carbon emissions. Out there, they can burn as much coal as they want. They can pump limitless smog into the air, manufacture their steel on the cheap, and absolutely destroy the local environment. And the ultimate punchline? Once that cheap, dirty steel is manufactured, they simply load it onto a ship, sail it right back into the European Union, and undercut all the local companies who actually followed the environmental rules. In the halls of EU bureaucracy, this incredibly frustrating phenomenon has a very boring name. They call it carbon leakage. Carbon leakage is a disaster for everyone. Europe loses its manufacturing jobs to other continents, but global emissions do not drop at all. The pollution just moves to a different zip code. The atmosphere shockingly does not care about national borders. So the European Union decided to stop playing nice and introduce the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. CBAM is essentially an environmental toll booth. The EU realized they cannot pass laws in other sovereign nations, but they absolutely control who gets to sell products into the rich European market. Under CBAM, if you want to import carbon-heavy products into the EU, you have to declare exactly how much pollution was created to make them, and then you have to pay a fee. To start, the EU is keeping things relatively simple by targeting the worst offenders. The initial phases of this carbon tax apply only to specific highly polluting industries. First on the list is cement. Cement production involves superheating limestone and is responsible for a staggering 8% of all global carbon dioxide emissions. It is incredibly dirty. Next up are iron and steel. These form the backbone of modern construction, but the blast furnaces required to make them consume mountains of coal and belch out toxic exhaust around the clock. The mechanism also covers aluminum, fertilizers, electricity, and even hydrogen. These are foundational materials. If the EU can force these specific supply chains to clean up, the ripple effects will be massive. So how does the fee actually work? It is brutally elegant. The importer must purchase CBAM certificates to cover the emissions embedded in their imported goods. The price of these certificates is not fixed. It is directly tied to the price of carbon inside the European Union's internal market. As it gets more expensive for a German factory to pollute, it gets exactly as expensive for a foreign factory to import. The competitive advantage of running away to a country with weak environmental laws vanishes instantly. The dirty foreign steel ends up costing exactly the same as the clean European steel. But here is where the mechanism transcends simple taxation and becomes a work of absolute geopolitical genius. The European Union included a very special clause. If the foreign manufacturer can prove they already paid a carbon price in their home country, the EU will deduct that amount from the border fee. You only pay the difference. Think about the incentives here. An industrialist like our friend Silas suddenly realizes he is going to pay a heavy carbon tax no matter what. The only question is, who gets the money? Foreign governments are looking at this and realizing that millions of dollars from their local industries are about to be handed directly to Brussels. No politician on earth likes watching tax revenue leave their country. This triggers the ultimate Brussels effect. To keep the tax money inside their own borders, foreign nations are suddenly rushing to create their very own internal carbon pricing systems. Countries like Turkey and the United Kingdom which export heavily to the European Union, suddenly found incredible domestic motivation to establish or tighten their own climate regulations. Of course, not everyone is thrilled. Trade partners across the globe are absolutely furious. They accuse the European Union of green protectionism and economic imperialism. The United States, China, and India have all threatened to challenge the mechanism at the World Trade Organization, claiming it is an illegal tariff designed to shield European industries from fair competition. But EU lawyers are nothing if not thorough. They carefully designed CBAM to comply with international trade law by framing it not as a tariff, but as an essential environmental measure applied equally to domestic and foreign goods. Because this is an EU initiative, it is naturally accompanied by a truly staggering amount of paperwork. The sheer complexity of accurately measuring carbon embedded in a complex product is a nightmare. How do you calculate the exact carbon footprint of a steel bolt manufactured in a grid that uses both solar power and coal? How do you verify the data coming from a factory 5,000 miles away? To avoid an immediate global trade meltdown, the EU introduced the system gradually. The transitional phase began in late 2023. During this transition, importers do not have to pay the tax yet. They just have to practice doing the math. They must calculate and report their emissions to prove they actually know how to track their supply chains. But the practice round ends in 2026. That is when the financial hammer drops and real money starts exchanging hands at the border. The era of free global pollution is officially closing. There are valid concerns about developing nations, countries that rely heavily on exporting raw materials like aluminum from Mozambique. Fear this tax will devastate their fragile economies before they can afford green infrastructure. The EU acknowledges this friction, but argues that providing exceptions would completely undermine the mechanism. Climate change will hit developing nations the hardest anyway, so the priority must be cutting emissions globally without compromise. This is a massive geopolitical gamble. If it fails, it could ignite a disastrous global trade war, fracturing supply chains and raising prices on foundational materials across the entire European continent. But if it succeeds, the European Union will have successfully weaponized its immense market power to force the entire planet to decarbonize its heavy industries. It is diplomacy through accounting. It is complex. It is infuriatingly bureaucratic, and it is entirely necessary. The EU loves a good spreadsheet, and this time they are using one to try and save the world. I suppose you could say the EU is finally forcing the world to take accountability for its carbon pawprints. Class dismissed.